Welcome to the Lost Meadow Gallery Roundchair Interviews. Today we are delighted to be welcoming the well-known Cornish artist Jo March, whose work is both fantastical and joyous and speaks to all who love her paintings of the Cornish landscape and people.
I realised that my influences are not necessarily artistic because they come from, they're a bit autobiographical, growing up in southeast Cornwall on the edge of the moor through the 60s and 70s when I wasn't painting and I wasn't thinking about painting and I was just observing like we all do. And I was always interested in art, but I never thought of myself as an artist, so I wasn't overly fascinated by artist technique or what they did. I saw pictures I liked. I always liked Stanley Spencer. I always liked Grant Wood, Samuel Palmer, people that painted landscape. But I also liked portraits. I was interested in historical portraits. I was always into history, primarily. So going to an exhibition of portraits when I was a bit older, that would be fascinating to me in itself. So I don't actually think that there was a clear influence of any particular art. I've always liked tendency towards realist art as opposed to abstract. So it's figurative more than abstract. But I think also it's just people and rural life and reading. I like a lot of what you call proper rural authors like Richard Jefferies, poets, Edward Thomas, that sort of thing. And actually, if I think about it, you said about the 50s vibe, I think I'm a massive Luddite and a massive nostalgically driven person. Not that I kind of think that it was an ideal time, any previous time, or that I've even got a sense of what that time is. But it's something to do with memory and it's something to do with atmospherics, and it's about former times in my head when I'm painting. It's not about now. At the time when I first started painting, it was on a whim. I'd graduated in history and I thought, what am I going to do? And I said, I'm going home to be an artist. Everybody laughed and said, are you really? That's going to be like a 6-month wonder. I went, no, I'm going to go home and paint. What are you going to paint? And I said, I don't know. So I came home and I bought some oils and some paper and things, and I lived at home with my mum and dad and the dogs and in a village like I'd always lived, where I'd lived all my life, and it was a curiosity to other people. And I had a bit of an affectation because I was having to front it out. It was such an odd decision to make. And art school had never been an option anyway. So I started to teach myself, but I probably was quite imitative to begin with because you're looking around thinking, well, how do I paint? What do I do? And it took time for a style to develop. And it was like an undertow because on the surface I was doing lots of really funny commissions for people because people would say, oh, Jo, you're painting then. Can you paint my dog? And I go, yeah, I can do that. How much? I say 20 quid, justifying what I was doing. But underneath it all, I was also painting what I fancied painting, which had this, straight away was into this figurative, slightly idiosyncratic, rural people mostly. I wasn't really painting landscapes. And then after a few years, the landscapes came to the fore a bit by dint of the fact that the people I was painting, I was making them up and they were becoming odder and odder. And one day I painted this picture and it had these terrible old men in a handcart being pulled along by this woman. And my husband said, that's awful, Jo. Those people are horrid. No one's going to like that. I said, don't you think so? He said, no, take them out. It's a nice landscape behind. And I said, I don't paint landscapes. He said, there's a landscape, you've painted one. So I wiped them out, oils, of course, it's easier. And there was this landscape. And it was all there. It was a style that I hadn't even noticed I was doing. And the people receded slightly for a while whilst I worked on this quite bucolic pastoral, big hills, groves, very English. As I know it's Cornwall, but I think of myself as a very English artist, really. And I discovered I had a style. So it was accidental, and I think it's by dint of not having gone to art school and not having anybody said, well, Jo, you know, you're a contemporary artist, you need to be thinking about... I didn't, I just made up stories and painted them, and the style just came. I tell you what happens is, I think it happens to everybody that paints over a long period of time, you develop motifs that recur. And initially I noticed I was repetitive, and I thought, oh, is this going to be a problem? I keep painting these certain figures, certain archetypal figures, and the landscape and the house is always very similar now in the paintings. And it bothered me for about 5 minutes. I thought, oh God, I'm becoming... Is it lack of imagination or something? Then I realised, no, actually what happens is it distills down into things that really count. And if you're content to be an artist that's telling their own story, and if you're content that your motifs are actually very honest and they are actually now coming out of you without really thinking about it, and you're not trying to do anything, then you realise your style has really moved on, and it makes you feel really satisfied. But it takes ages before you realise that's a good thing. When I was a very small girl, my granddad, who was Irish, had kept greyhounds. He always had dogs, and I remember being small and there was this big stripy greyhound called Beezer that he used to bring down. And he was a bit of a poacher, and he was a bit of a gamekeeper as well. He'd done both sides, and he was very eccentric and quite a difficult man. And I remember he had these big lanky dogs that he used to dispatch himself when they got old, which was shocking to his daughter, who was my mother, obviously. And she liked greyhounds. We never had any all through my life until I got home from university, and somebody offered me a dog that had been racing. And I'd had 2 lurchers, and they said, do you want another dog? And I said, well, I don't know. They said, she's called Lucky. And he turned up with this white greyhound. She was terrified of everything, beautiful. And I looked at her and I started painting because I was drawn to this thing. And also she had a kind of, there's something in them, something very old about long-legged hounds and about their place all through history in the countryside. And also they've fallen from, their status has fallen. And I think that's really sad, and it's interesting because they're beautiful and gentle, and I've had loads now, all ex-racers. And racing is such a horrid, debased sport really. Now, so much money and there's so little love in it for a lot of the dogs. And yet they're grand, they're like aristocratic dogs. And they're ending up in, I'm sorry, I shouldn't rant. They're ending up in China, you know, in food markets. It makes me furious, absolutely furious. And you think these are the dogs that a peasant couldn't own in the Middle Ages, and they've been sold for quids by unspeakable people to other unspeakable people. So, but I paint them also because they are Arcadian, and it's about the countryside and moonlight and dogs out with masters and Diana and magic and all that stuff. So everything about greyhounds is beautiful to me, apart from their fate. Some people say, a bit sinister, Jo, don't like that one. When I'm painting them, to me they're really amusing. And idiosyncratic is a good word because they're not meant to be unpleasant. But, you know, life, especially rural life, is full of dark corners, and it's full of oddly drawn characters and houses that make you think twice before you walk past. But that's partly joyous, it's partly scary in a good way. Some of it's tragic and melancholic, but it all is about the fullness of experience, of living in a place, especially if you live in a place your whole life. my mum was the village nurse, and so she was involved in everything, and she was a massive, big-hearted tyrant, really. And so everybody did what she said in De Wright, and she used to write these pantomimes and make people go in them, and we'd all have to dress up. And so I painted this portrait, which was like a family picture, and it's my mum and dad, and my dad is very laconic and straight-faced, wearing a big wig in a sort of a Baron Hardup outfit, and my mum is Baroness. And she's got me on her knee, and I look, I'm like a puppety thing. And my daughter is working it, because she was like, she's lovely, but she's a little monkey as well. She was a little tyrant as a girl. And it's true, it's a kind of a family portrait of a intensely odd family that we were. I can see ways that I could paint pictures that would be much more accessible in a wider way, much prettier, if you like, because some of them are quite sort of dark, really. Not, you know, they're painted with rich, dark colours and things, and everybody likes bright blue skies, don't they? But I had quite an eccentric home life, and I was quite a funny little girl when I was small, and didn't really get on with other children very well. So I think the paintings, it's a stream, isn't it? It comes out of you. And now it's fine, I get on with everybody, and I'm perfectly happy, functioning, not even slightly dysfunctional person, I think. And I'm really grateful for all of that eccentricity. At the time, when you're small and you come from quite a strange, that's odd, when your mum's quite eccentric and your dad's a little bit eccentric as well, and all of your relatives seem to be, when you're a kid you just want to be like everybody else, don't you? You want to live in a bungalow and wear mini skirts and things, and you don't want to wear long plastic dresses and Tutankhamun pendants and have vote Labour Free Ireland badges on you when you go to school. You don't want to be that kid. You want to like Donny Osmond, don't you? Not the Wolfe Tones. So that sort of thing. When you're small, you're not comfortable. Now I rejoice in all that. I'm really grateful for all those unusual influences that started from the year dot, and I'm grateful to my mum for fostering some kinds of love of literature and outsider stuff. She was central to the village, but she was a pure outsider in her attitudes. The landscapes are all invented. They're imaginary places. So whilst I might start at a point on the painting that's got a certain familiarity to it, you know, I'll be interested in a group of fields that I've seen, or the way some trees are growing, or a gate. The painting grows organically, totally from my head, and they're a bit like walks, you know, you start somewhere and you carry on. So, sorry, I'm fidgeting. So when I paint the landscapes, although they're Cornish in inspiration, I actually think they're more generally British, English, whatever. I don't actually think of them as being purely Cornish. They've got to have hills in them, which could place them in other places as well. There's a few things coming up. I write a bit, so I'm trying to focus a bit on producing narratives that go with the paintings, which all sounds a bit cutesy. It doesn't have to be. What happens is sometimes I'll paint a picture and I can see the story in it, and then I'm inspired, compelled to write down a few paragraphs about it. And I've got an exhibition in Suffolk next year at Imagine Gallery, and we've already spoken briefly that I'm going to produce either one piece of extended writing with pictures that illustrate that, or it could be a series of paintings and brief pieces that go with each one, and produce a book with it. So the next plan really is to try and actually turn the paint into written words as well, and combine the two. Other things, I've got all sorts going on, really. That's what's preoccupying me, because it's a challenge to actually write. But since so much of the stuff that I paint springs from things I've read, Walter de la Mare, people like that paint with words, it seems to me to be inevitable that I'm going to start writing. That's the other thing about growing, a little more mature, is you think, oh, I've really got to start packing this in, getting it going. You never know if your hand might drop off or your eyeballs invert or whatever. What are you going to do? You've got to get all this stuff done. And I still feel exactly like I did when I was 25 when I started, except I know what I'm doing now. And I'm worried now that I won't get everything done in the next 40 years, God willing.